The last time I saw my daughter-in-law, Margaret, she was wearing a wool coat I'd never seen before and carrying grocery bags into the house she shared with my son. That was 18 months before the morning I found her standing outside a Tim Hortons on Carling Avenue in Ottawa, in November, with no coat at all, holding my 7-year-old grandson's hand. I almost drove past her. I was on my way to my Tuesday volunteer shift at the food bank on Merivale Road, the one I've been going to every week since I retired from nursing. I was stopped at the red light, thinking about nothing in particular, whether I'd remembered my reusable bags, whether it would snow before I got home, and then I looked to my right, and I saw her. Standing on the sidewalk in a thin cardigan, shoulders hunched against the cold, and little Theo pressed against her side with his backpack still on. I pulled into the parking lot so fast I nearly clipped the curb. I called her name through the window, and she looked up, and what I saw in her face wasn't relief. It was shame. Pure, absolute shame. She looked like she wanted the sidewalk to open up and swallow her whole. Theo saw me and started waving with his whole arm, the way little kids do, and that small bright wave in the middle of all that gray November morning broke something open in my chest. I got out of the car and walked over to her, and I didn't say anything clever or careful. I just said, "Margaret, where's your coat?" She started crying before she could answer me. I put them both in the car. I turned the heat all the way up. I gave Theo the granola bar I had in my purse, and I held Margaret's hand and I waited. She cried for a few minutes with her face turned toward the window, and then she took a long breath and she said, "I don't know where to start." I told her to start anywhere. What she told me over the next hour, sitting in that parking lot with the engine running and Theo eventually falling asleep against her shoulder, was the kind of thing that makes you understand how slowly a person can lose everything before they even realize it's happening. Margaret had met my son David 12 years earlier at a work event in Canada. David was in software sales. Margaret was a registered nurse working at the Civic Hospital, had been for 8 years by then. She was careful with money, she told me. She had a pension through the hospital, a TFSA she'd been contributing to since she was 26, a small RRSP. She owned a condo in Centertown that she'd bought on her own at 31. When she and David got together and eventually got married, they bought the house in Barhaven together. Her condo she rented out for income. Everything seemed from the outside like two sensible people building a life. I believed that. I had no reason not to. David was my son. I loved him. I still love him. The way you love someone even when you've had to accept something terrible about who they are. The first thing I didn't know was that David had a gambling problem. Not the kind you notice right away, not lottery tickets at the corner store or weekend trips to Casino de Lac Limy. The kind that lives on your phone at 2 in the morning, on offshore betting sites, in accounts that don't show up anywhere a spouse might think to look. He'd had it, Margaret later found out, since his mid-20s. He'd hidden it from everyone, including me. The second thing I didn't know was that David had a friend named Craig who had, over the years, become less of a friend and more of an accomplice. Craig did something in financial services Margaret was never entirely sure what, and he had, according to what came out later, helped David access things he had no right to access. Margaret told me it started small. David began managing the household finances. He said he was better at it, and honestly, she said, she was working long shifts, she was tired, and it seemed like a reasonable division of labor. She trusted him. He was her husband. Then the credit card bills started coming in for things she didn't remember buying. A furniture purchase at a store in Nepean she'd never been to, a weekend at a hotel in Niagara Falls she had no memory of. When she asked David about them, he had an answer every time. "You were so tired that weekend, you said you wanted to go somewhere warm and then you forgot. That was for the new chair in the spare room, don't you remember? You were the one who said we needed it." She started to wonder if something was wrong with her memory. She was working nights sometimes, sleeping odd hours. She was exhausted in the way that nurses get exhausted, the kind that goes into your bones after years of it. She started to think maybe she really was buying things and forgetting. She mentioned it to her doctor, who ran some tests, found nothing, suggested she might be under too much stress. What she didn't know was that David and Craig had opened 3 credit cards in her name, using her SIN, her date of birth, her nursing college registration number. They'd had the statements sent to an email address that wasn't hers. They'd been making purchases on those cards for nearly 2 years. She found out about the Centertown condo by accident. She was talking to a colleague at the hospital who mentioned something about the rental market in Centertown, and Margaret said she had a unit there, and her colleague said, "Oh, I thought that building sold recently." Margaret thought nothing of it at the time, but she looked it up that night on the MPAC website just out of curiosity. The property was listed under a numbered company, not her name. She told me she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, very still, the way you go still when your brain is trying to protect you from something it's already understood. Then she asked David about it. He told her she'd agreed to sell it. She'd been there for the signing. Did she not remember? It was months ago. She'd said herself she was tired of being a landlord. He pulled out a document with her signature on it. She said the signature looked like hers. She said that was the part that frightened her most, that she couldn't be certain. She'd signed so many things over the years, refinancing paperwork, insurance forms, the mortgage when they bought the house. She couldn't remember every signature. She couldn't prove she hadn't been there. I want to be very clear about something, because I know how this sounds from the outside. I know people will wonder how an educated woman, a nurse with years of training, a person who makes life and death decisions at work every week, could not know what was happening to her own finances. I've been a nurse too. I know what I know about the human mind, and about what prolonged stress and manipulation do to a person's ability to trust their own perception. There is a word for what David was doing to Margaret, and that word is gaslighting, and it works precisely because it is slow and quiet, and it is done by someone you love and have no reason to distrust. The shame people feel when it happens to them is part of how it works. The shame keeps you silent. The silence keeps you isolated. The isolation keeps you vulnerable. Margaret said the moment she understood something was genuinely wrong, not with her, but with him, was when she tried to access her hospital pension account online and was locked out. She called the pension office and was told that there had been a change request made on the account, a change she had not made. She confronted David that night, and something shifted in him. The patient, reasonable explanations stopped. He told her that if she made trouble, she would lose Theo. He knew people, he said. He would make her look unstable. He would bring up the memory issues, the doctor's visit, the things she couldn't account for. No judge would give a child to a woman who couldn't remember what she'd bought or signed. He said it calmly, in the kitchen, while Theo was upstairs doing homework. She believed him. She was terrified. She started sleeping on the couch, then in the car when things got bad at night. Then, after David told her one evening that the house was being sold, and she needed to find somewhere else to go, she didn't know where to go. She didn't call me. I have thought about this a great deal in the months since. I was her mother-in-law, not her mother. I was David's mother. She had no way of knowing how I would respond, which side I would take. She was ashamed. She was frightened. She had been told, over and over, in a dozen small ways, that her perception could not be trusted. Asking for help requires a degree of self-certainty that David had spent years eroding. So she and Theo had been staying at a women's shelter on the West End. She hadn't told anyone. She was going through the motions of every day getting Theo to school, making it look normal, and then coming back to the shelter at night. When I found her on that sidewalk outside the Tim Hortons, she had $23 in her wallet and a bag at the shelter with 3 days' worth of clothes for herself and Theo. She had no idea what David had done with the money from the condo sale. She had no idea how deep the credit card debt went. She had no idea the pension had been touched. She found all of that out later. What she knew that morning was that she was cold, and she was hungry, and she was humiliated, and she had been standing there for 20 minutes trying to decide whether she could afford to buy Theo a muffin. I am 63 years old. I have been a nurse for 35 years. I have held people's hands while they died. I have told families things no one should have to say. I am not a person who panics. But sitting in that parking lot listening to my daughter-in-law tell me what my son had done to her, what my son had done to his own little boy, I felt something I don't have a clinical word for. It was somewhere between grief and fury, and a cold, quiet determination that arrived like the first hard frost of the season. Everything clarified. I took them home with me that afternoon. I didn't ask. I told Margaret she was coming home with me, and she didn't argue. The first call I made was to my friend Louise, who has been a family lawyer in Ottawa for nearly 20 years. I did not ask her to recommend someone. I asked her to take the case herself. and she agreed to meet us the next morning. The second call I made was to my nephew on my sister's side who works as an investigative accountant, the kind hired to find money that people have tried to make disappear. I won't share his name here. He knows what he did, and his fee was the least of what David deserved to pay. What they found over the following weeks was methodical and thorough and, by the end of it, more than enough. The 3 credit cards opened fraudulently in Margaret's name, totaling just over $41,000 in charges. The condo in Centertown, sold to the numbered company, which turned out, when my nephew dug into the incorporation documents, to be registered to David and Craig jointly for $208,000, well below market value for Centertown at the time. Margaret's RRSP, partially liquidated without her authorization, about $14,000. The pension had been tampered with but not successfully drained because the hospital's pension administrator had flagged the change request as irregular and put a hold on it. That, Margaret said when she found out, made her cry harder than anything else, that somewhere in the system, someone had done their job and it had protected her without her ever knowing. David and Craig, when they were eventually arrested, each tried to blame the other. David's lawyer suggested Margaret had been a willing participant who had simply changed her story. Louise handled that suggestion with the kind of quiet efficiency I have always admired in her. The digital records told the story clearly: the email accounts Craig had set up, the IP addresses, the timestamps on the account change requests, made while Margaret was logged in for a night shift at the hospital. The incorporation date of the numbered company 3 months before the condo sale, the transfers. The correspondence between David and Craig discussing what to do with M's pension situation. It took 8 months from that November morning to the day the judge handed down the sentences. David received 4 years less a day in federal custody, plus 3 years of probation. Craig received 3.5 years. The sentencing judge cited the sustained nature of the fraud, the exploitation of a domestic relationship, the impact on a minor child, and the deliberate use of identity theft as aggravating factors. I sat in that courtroom and I watched my son be let out, and I felt grief and relief at the same time. And I have learned to hold both of those things without needing to resolve them. The condo sale was challenged and reversed. The numbered company was dissolved. The $41,000 in fraudulent credit card charges was formally attributed to David and Craig, not to Margaret, and the relevant credit bureau entries were corrected. Her credit score, which had been destroyed, was restored. Margaret's RRSP funds were recovered through the civil proceedings we launched alongside the criminal case. The pension remained intact. The house in Barhaven, the family home, is in the process of being dealt with through the divorce proceedings, which are ongoing. Louise is handling it. Theo is in 2nd grade. He sees a child therapist at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario once a week, a kind woman he apparently refers to as the feelings doctor, which I find both heartbreaking and exactly right. He stayed in his school. He sleeps in my guest room, which I have let him decorate however he wants, and he has chosen a great many glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and a poster of a red-tailed hawk. He is doing better than you might expect. Children are, I have learned over 6 decades, more resilient than we deserve. Margaret went back to the Civic Hospital 4 months ago. Her colleagues gave her a card, and someone brought butter tarts. She told me about it at Sunday dinner, and she laughed for the first time in a way that reached her eyes. I think about that morning on Carling Avenue more than I probably should. The way she was standing there trying to do the arithmetic on whether she could buy her son a muffin, the thin cardigan, the shame on her face when she heard her name. I have made peace with the fact that I didn't know sooner. I have tried. What I know is that I got there when I got there, and I did not waste a single hour after that. Some situations don't ask you to be wise or patient. They ask you to be useful, immediately, without hesitation. After 35 years in nursing, I know how to do that. Margaret asked me once, a few months after everything, if I was angry at David. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told her the truth, which is that I am angry in the way you're angry at a disease, not the wild, hot anger that passes, the quiet, heavy kind that sits with you. I loved my son. I did not know him as well as I thought I did. Those two things are both true, and I carry them both. What I am not is quiet. I volunteer now at a women's resource center near Bell's Corners. Once a week, in addition to the food bank, I talk to women and occasionally men who are navigating what Margaret navigated. I am not a lawyer or a financial advisor. I am a retired nurse who is 63 years old and has seen a great many things. What I tell them is the same thing I told Margaret on that cold morning in the car with the heat running and her little boy asleep against her shoulder. You are not losing your mind. You are not bad with money. You are not the problem. And wherever you are right now, it is not where you will stay.